All right, so I think we are live. Let me actually get situated so I can see chat on my phone. I am streaming on OBS, so there's a delay between what I see real time and Facebook, so I want to make sure that all of this is working, and we'll get started soon. So, let's see. Actually get situated. All right, very cool. Okay, so let me get OBS. So, my name is Sherry Shish. I am powered by quilting for the most part, and today we are going to be doing a foundation paper piecing tutorial using the sun block that I designed for Qual by the Sea. So that's the block up here. This is the block in real life. So this block uses two different techniques. One, it's traditional piecing, which is the main portion of the block, but I decided to use foundation paper piecing for the raise. Foundation paper piecing can give you some really nice points and give you a lot of different angles that you cannot get from normal piecing. Hi Karen, good morning. We're going to do a couple things in the beginning. I'm going to talk about why paper piecing, the supplies you need, a couple different things that I have found helpful, and a couple, just tips and tricks about fabric and how to do it. And then we'll actually go ahead and then do the demo and the live tutorial. So I have my machine just right here. You can't quite see it. I couldn't figure out how to get that on screen at the same time, but I zoomed in my camera on my cutting board so you can actually see the manipulation of the paper and fabric. So, why paper piecing? I could not figure out a way to get my little raise in the orientation that it is now by traditional piecing. So, paper piecing I use for the specialty shapes. I personally really like traditional piecing, so I will try to do that first, but for something like this, foundation paper piecing was way easier. So a couple things that you'll need for paper piecing. You will need to print off the templates. So if you're using this as a tutorial for any of the paper piecing, print off the templates that you're using, but if you're using the sun, on page 4 of the pattern, you will need to print 4 of these. So you have 4 corner blocks and 4 little side blocks. The other thing that I will tell you is I print these off on normal printer paper, and normal printer paper is what I just normally use in my house. There's a couple other things that you could buy. They sell papers for foundation paper piecing. Sorry, I have a big glare from my light. The paper that comes in this kit is a little bit thinner than normal printer paper. It's like newsprint. And the newsprint, some folks find it easier to take the papers out when they're done. I personally find it that it shreds, and then I end up with like little tiny pieces of paper in my blocks, which I don't particularly love. They also make some stabilizer, like wash away stabilizer that you can print and then sew as well. And the wash away stabilizer, if you decide to use that, I would highly recommend using a ink printer. A LaserJet printer will then leave the print lines in the middle of your quilt, which you don't really want to do. And so that's kind of where we're at. For the templates and the paper for normal printing, I have a LaserJet printer at home, which means if I were to hit my black lines on my laser printed paper, I will get black lines on my iron. So there's 2 different types of printers out there. The LaserJet printer actually heat presses or heat like prints the black lines on the piece of paper. An inkjet printer actually has the ink that soaks into the paper. So you can hit paper that's been inkjet printed with an iron without getting the ink on your paper, on your iron. But since I know I have laser printing, you have to be very careful you don't hit the paper with the iron. So once you have your templates, you want to make sure to always check your templates with the 1-inch block. If you don't check it with a 1-inch block, you end up potentially not having the correct size pieces. So I take my ruler And this is a perfect 1-inch block that I measured against. To get a perfect 1-inch block, make sure you don't scale your printer and you print it at 100%. For those of you that are not in the US, my templates are on US letter, which I believe is smaller than A1 or A4 paper, whatever you guys use. And I believe that it should work if you are printing at 100%. So a couple of the other things that you will need for paper piecing. You need a ruler. I find it optional to use a 1/4-inch ruler. You don't technically need one. You can use a normal ruler if you would want. And then what I find super interesting or super helpful is this double-sided tape. So this is like a scrapbooking tape. Essentially there's tape on one end and you like mark it and it leaves the tape on the other side. Some folks use a glue stick. I've used a glue stick before as well. Depending on the type of glue stick that you get, I've had paper like rip apart and then stick still onto the back of my fabric. So I don't know if I just got the wrong one, but I had used it before on multiple projects and it was fine. And then all of a sudden, it got old and it started sticking on the back of my fabric. So the other thing I forgot to put on my blog post that you will need is some sort of seam roller. I use a finger presser tool. Full embarrassment here, I don't use a seam roller. I've tried to use a seam roller and I couldn't get my seams flat. So I completely think it's user error because so many other people seem to do okay with the seam rollers as well. And then obviously you'll need a rotary cutter and then my machine, which is right here that you can't see on camera. So the first thing that I do when I have templates, I'm just going to use one of them because I printed off 4 sheets. I'm going to put that away. I have given colors by section. So depending on how you want to make your block, whether it's this pattern or a different one, I always find it very convenient to label your pieces as well with the actual colors. So in this case, this A1 is blue, so I'll put blue. A3 is blue, I'll just use a B. A5, A7, B1, B3, and B5. And then my other pieces of yellow, if you're going to be using the 3 different types of yellow, I highly recommend labeling your blocks as well, so you don't have to keep referencing back to the color sections. So main, yellow, yellow, accent 1, so yellow 1, B4 is yellow 1, A4 is yellow 2, and then B2 is also yellow 2. And so that's just kind of how I end up keeping my coloring straight while I paper piece. Okay, so that's done with the pen. So the next thing that I end up doing when I paper piece is I will go ahead and rough cut the templates out. And by rough cutting, I don't cut on the seam allowance themselves because I figure I'll be trimming up the block anyways, so it doesn't really matter. The nice thing about paper piecing is that you can easily scale the pattern up or down. And if you scale your pattern larger, then when you look at the paper piecing like seam allowance, the seam allowance is going to be wrong, right? So if you expand a 1/4 inch, it's going to be too big. If you shrink down the pattern, then the seam allowance is actually going to be too small. So I just use the seam allowances as a reference, and I always cut or trim with the actual block size. And I do that just because if you expand or enlarge or shrink your pattern. Okay. So I'm actually going to be doing the smaller template first because it's a little easier. And I should realize I probably need to explain the actual lettering on the blocks. So that is done for that one. Let me get a normal size template first. So the way that the blocks are labeled, so you'll notice the big block has A's on them and the small block has B's. And really the order of how you assemble and how you sew matter. So A1, A2, A3, A4, the way that blocks are normally numbered is that A1, or whatever 1 is on your piece, is the first fabric that goes on the block. Then you sew number 2, number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in that order. I tend to label one block at a time as a single letter. So this block is the A block. This block on the bottom is the B block. And you'll start at B1, add B2, B3, B4, and B5. Okay? So just kind of a little bit more reference on your labels. Now, how do I cut my fabric for these lovely templates? There is a specific reason on why I do not give you measurements on paper pieced patterns. I know a lot of designers, or some designers will, and some people really want the dimensions on what to cut your fabric. So I personally do not do that for 2 reasons. One, I find that I spent too much time in the past on paper piecing patterns, cutting out the exact block that a designer has said that, you know, for this block, for B1, you need to cut out this kind of a square or this kind of a rectangle. And either 2 things happened. One, that rectangle was too big, so I wasted too much fabric and I didn't like that. Or 2, I did not have enough fabric, meaning when I sewed it together and I flipped my paper over, I didn't cover the whole template. And so I found those to be a little bit problematic. Everybody paper pieces slightly differently from each other, and so finding what works for you is kind of the key. So I have a couple just scrap pieces of fabric that I'll use. I have, I have a couple layer cake squares that are blue that I'll probably use for my sky. And then I picked up through my stash of batik fabric as well. And one of the things that somebody posted in the Facebook group about batik fabric, oh yes, Karen, it's usually too small and then I get really upset and angry about it. So I never follow the pattern instructions unless I trust the designer. And honestly, for me, I still would just cut it myself. So a couple things about batik fabric. There was someone that mentioned, as a beginner, batik fabrics are really great. And a lot of that is because you have no wrong side to the fabric. So regardless of which way you put it on the paper, it's going to be right. With normal fabric, if you put it on the paper wrong, it's going to be wrong. Sorry. So how do we make sure that the direction of the fabric is correct? When you look at your paper piecing template, the printed side, the side that has all your little sewing lines on it, is on the back of the piece of paper. Oh, it's on the back of on the block, I guess is what I want to say. Meaning, if you flip it over, the right side of fabric should be facing up this way. Does that make sense? So this is the back, this is the front. So how do we start? Well, actually, how do I cut the sizes for my fabric? Let's just start there. So what I like to do, and this is Sherry's personal fabric cutting. When I look at my size of template and I look at what size I need to do this, I have blue in B1, B3, and B5. If I put my template here, I'm going to grab a longer ruler and I cut, like so. I know for a fact my template is smaller than any piece that I'm going to cut from my fabric, and I don't have a ton of waste at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this. It's the same kind of deal. Oops. It's the same kind of deal for the ones in the middle here. I would actually take a little bit of a measurement, so this middle section is just over 2 inches. I would cut it maybe 3 inches. Because it's just over 2 inches, but you need to make sure you add your seam allowances, so it makes it just over 2.5. Give yourself a little bit more wiggle room, but you don't need to cut the piece to be like 4 inches. Give yourself, a little wiggle room, but not the whole world. All right, so we're gonna start. I'm trying to double check I have notes on what I wanted to make sure I covered. So I'm gonna start with B1, which is a blue piece, right? So how do I attach my first piece of fabric to this one here? What I like to do is I like to fold on my first seam line. So between B1 and B2, I'm going to fold my piece of paper like so. Okay. I'm going to open that back up. And remember, like what I said, the printed side of the on the paper is the back. So on this side, what I'm going to do here, and this is where double-sided tape or a glue stick really helps, and it's really helpful for the very first piece. I'm going to put some tape on the back of B1, enough to essentially make sure this fabric sticks. One thing that I will remind you guys is do not put the double-sided tape on the fabric. Tape on the paper. And I'm grinning because I've done that before and it's really hard to get off the fabric and you're sitting there like trying to pick it off. So tape on the paper, not on the fabric. So for this piece, right, I want to make sure I cover this piece completely and I give myself a seam allowance past where my fold line is, okay? For me, I'm just gonna plop that on there. I'm not gonna worry yet about my seam allowance. I just know that that's gonna be more than my 1/4 inch that I'm gonna need, okay? I'm gonna flip that over, make sure that I see it. I see it on both sides. You wanna make sure that the fabric goes up, extends across or beyond your seam allowance for that. And then I'm just gonna cut off the excess fabric right here. Ta-da! So that's piece number 1. It's taped onto my piece of paper. I have it extending outside of all of those. So piece number 2. How do I get piece number 2 to be this yellow piece? So same kind of deal what I'm gonna do before. I'm just gonna cut this in half or so. I'm just gonna, oops, not cut in half. I'm just gonna cut the excess off of this. You can paper piece with smaller pieces. I can show you how to do that as well, but for me, it's okay. I'm just using scraps at this point. So with this fold line, I need my yellow piece to be past this B2 section. Okay, so knowing that, if I were to put right sides together, right? So right sides of the fabric together, this is the right side of piece 1, right side of piece 2 together. I'm just gonna match them up because I know I have enough seam allowance. And I fold this piece of paper back. All I am checking right now is, does piece 2 fit on the yellow? I'm gonna scoot that up. So right sides together, not on the white paper, but right sides, so fabric goes on fabric. I'm gonna fold this back and say, hey, my B2 ends here, here, and I know my fabric goes towards the edge. I should be good. When I unfold it, you see how I have this nice little crease here. That's where that seam allowance is gonna go. I could technically move my fabric smaller, like closer to me, right? And then make that seam allowance smaller. It's up to you. How much fabric do you want to cut off and trim, and how much extra fabric do you need? But this is how you check you have enough fabric in your seam allowance, and this is how you check when you fold it down that your fabric that you're adding covers the entire section of that next color or that next block that you're adding. Now, how do you sew these pieces together? Number 1, on your sewing machine, you will want to make sure that your stitch length is below 2. A lot of people say 1.8. I use somewhere probably close around 1.5. And the reason why we do that is this paper, at the end of the day, when you needle punch it so many times so closely, it'll perforate and the papers will be easier to get out. Remember how I said in the beginning of the tutorial, they make paper for foundation paper piecing. That paper is a little bit more like newsprint. When I have too small of stitches on newsprint, the paper tends to shred, more so come across cleanly. The other one that I will also mention with the stabilizer, if you are using wash away stabilizer, so you're printing on that, you're not taking that out, you don't need to change your stitch length if you're using wash away stabilizer. The downside with using wash away stabilizer is that you have to buy it. You also need to use an inkjet printer, and it gets a little pricey if you're going to be paper piecing a lot. Yes, So Sandra, it is way better to use bigger pieces. I will show at the end, like, how do you seam rip? If you actually put it and the piece completely shifts on you when you sew, how do you fix that? So I'm going to go ahead. And so what I do here is I know my seam allowance is good. I know my fabric placement is good. I'm just going to hold my fabric. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to the machine, flip it over, and I'm going to sew on that line. And I'm going to start sewing and stop sewing on either end of the seam allowance. Meaning I'm going to start at the edge and go all the way to the other edge. You have to remember, even in paper piecing, you need to sew your seam allowances. All right. Let me see if I can do this, because this is not where I normally sew, but I wanted to make sure I didn't have to move a lot. All right, so I've sewn my line. This is a horrible seam allowance. I don't know if you guys can see that. The fabric moved a little bit, but that's not a big deal. It moved up, so my seam allowance is a little bigger than it needs to be. But if I were to fold my page down again, my B2 covers the entire fabric. We're good to go. Now, to clean up the seam allowance, what do you do? So I end up folding my paper. So I flip it over so my paper's on top. I fold my paper away so it's just the seam allowances here. Now you can use a normal ruler, or you can use your 1/4" ruler to essentially align and cut off anything above a 1/4". So this is why I'm saying 1/4" ruler is handy. You can use a normal ruler as well. Align it with the 1/4" and trim. I've also taken classes before on smaller paper piecing where the instructor said, just use your scissors. You know, it's not going to kill you. It's a seam allowance. So now that we've sewn this first piece on, I'm going to take my seam ruler. I use a finger presser tool. You can use a seam roller. You can go use your iron. Either way, flip this piece over. And I'm going to just press the seam down. All right? So again, fabric side, print side is the back. Now, we have piece 1 and piece 2 sewn together. How do we add piece 3? So it's a very similar thing that we did to add B2. What we're going to do is I'm going to fold the piece of paper between B2 and B3. And if you're thinking to yourself, why, Sherry, you have a really, really big B2 piece. What are you going to do? I am going to leave it for now because we're going to trim it up again. You theoretically could, let me keep folding this. You theoretically could trim off like the excess yellow here. I mean, it doesn't hurt anything. All right, B2. So that fold line here is where the thread's gonna go. That's where the seam allowance is. And now B3, since I've labeled my block, is going to be a blue piece. I'm gonna go back and find my blue fabric, okay? Now here's where it gets tricky. I'm gonna actually fold this to me, so B3 is here. So my seam allowance is that way, right? So normally when you do this, remember fabric, right side of fabric goes to right side of fabric. So I'm gonna put that here. I'm gonna just test and see if this works, right? When you have angles, it gets really goofy on, you know, when you flip it over, did you sew it on the correct side for it to flip over the right or left way? Does that make sense? It gets confusing. So I always just test it. I'll fold this back down and say, oh, hey, perfect. I actually picked the right side, right? So when I fold this over for B3, my B3 triangle fits on this blue line or this blue fabric that I put down. Does that make sense? So for example, if I were to actually like put it this direction or something, oh, this one will probably work too, but I can fold it this direction and the B3 will still also fit on the blue piece. Any questions on that? However, I'm going to replace it here and I'll go back to what I was going to say. So right side of fabric, right side of fabric. Fold it back down. And this fold represents where my thread is actually stitching, right? So anything above this is my seam allowance. So you see my fold line is right here. I have a pretty hefty seam allowance. That's okay. We'll trim it back down. It's much better than, say, if I accidentally put it too far down, right, and folded it. My seam allowance may get too small. So I'm going to actually make it a little bigger. Fold it down. And one of the things that you'll want to make sure is you see I can see the little edge of my fabric strip right here. That tells me that I have it far enough over to cover the whole B3. If I had moved this piece too far to the left, right, and folded it down, do you see how I no longer can see my fabric? That means if I stitched it down where it is now and I flipped it over, my fabric does not cover everything. All right, so I'm going to move that back over like so. Both sides, I see fabric, or I can kind of guesstimate fabric on this side, fabric here. And then I'm going to flip this over and stitch on my line. All right. So stitching on the line, if you notice I started, let me pull this up. I stitched off the paper on both sides. You see where your seam intersects at this point. Now I want to trim off the seam allowance, right? So I'm going to look at the paper. I'm going to fold the stuff I haven't sewn towards me. Uh-oh, I can't fold this all the way because of the seam allowance. Guess what? We're just going to rip that a little bit, fold it down, and then fold the paper down. So where that seam first started, we're just going to take that apart right now. It's not a big deal. Now we're going to trim off our 1/4 inch on this end. So lining up your 1/4 inch line with your seam line, or your 1/8 inch ruler, or your add a 1/4 ruler. You can cut that off. I do not backstitch, Sandra. So I do not backstitch because we are already at like a 1.5 inch stitch length, so it doesn't really matter. When we start looking at our A block, where we have seams in the middle of the block, I'll show you what I do with making sure that the seams are also sewn as well, like at the edges. Some people that paper piece start exactly where the line starts and sews. But out of habit for me and security, I want to make sure that my seams are also sewn. Okay, so once we've trimmed that, I'm going to flip the paper over, and then I'm going to flip this piece down. So ta-da! Seam roll, seam press, iron, whatever you want to do. So now we have our B1, our B2, and now this is our B3. So how do we add B4? So we do the same thing that we did before. We're going to fold. I'm going to actually throw that away. Throw this up here, not throw it away. Throw this up here when I fold my B4 piece. So this is B3 to B4. Okay. So I'm going to put this back down. So at this point, if you have a really, really big tail, theoretically, you can go ahead and cut it. Like, easiest way to make sure that your B3 is the correct size. Pretend you've already sewn this piece, right? So you can fold B4 towards you. You're gonna have to pop the seam allowance real quick to do that. Like so. For me, I typically like, if I'm gonna do this, give myself more than a 1/4 inch to cut it off. And the only reason why I'm doing this is to get myself away from this big floppy strip of fabric. So I'm going to do like maybe 1/2 inch here. Some folks, paper piecing tutorials will have you actually do your 1/4 inch seam before you sew, and have you sew your 1/4 inch seam like normal. Paper piecing for me is you sew on a line. You sew on your printed line, and it gets rid of having to make sure that your fabric stays together the whole time you're sewing when you just can sew on the line. Okay, so fold it again. That's where the fabric's gonna go. This next piece is gonna be our yellow 1. I'm gonna use this as yellow 1 or something like that. Used a scrap piece. I don't really technically need one this big, but you know what? If I didn't feel like cutting it down, easy, right? Again, right side of fabric goes to right side of fabric. If I were to stitch it down like so, this is not gonna be right. Right side of fabric, right? This is the block that we've already made, goes to right side of fabric this direction. I'm going to reiterate that as we go through our blocks. So when I fold this back down, that's where our seam allowance is going to go. And then when I fold this over, I go, oh, hey, this is like way too big. I knew it was way too big, but I don't actually need to cut a piece. I could theoretically shift it down a little bit to make it fit a little nicer, right? So I'm not in like the middle of my big yellow scrap. And then I'm going to go ahead and take this to my machine and stitch it. Okay, so I stitched it down. I don't know if you guys can tell. You can see my fabric is not aligned whatsoever. I'm okay with that because all I care about is when I press the fabric open or to the other side, which is the same thing as folding it, I cover that B4 piece. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to trim the seam allowance to the correct size. So to do that again, paper side, print side up, all the fabric towards you, fold that seam line that you're trimming down. I'm going to flip that one down as well. And then now we're going to trim a 1/4 inch off of the seam that you just sewed. Okay, like so. Ta-da! I'm going to flip it over. This fabric that I use is like a woven. I was picking out fabric from my scrap stash and this is what I got. So I'm going to go ahead and press this down. Seam roller, iron, whatever it is. I'm going to press that down. Okay. And now we are going to be adding our last B5 piece, which is blue that I've labeled. Now in this case, because this is unwieldy, you can do something very simple of like, I'm just going to cut this off. I theoretically don't even need all of the B5, but I'm just trying to get this out of my way. Okay. Now for B5, same thing as we did before. We're going to fold on the B4 to B5 line. I'm going to go get my blue strip that I've already made. And remember, this is the fabric side, this is the seam allowance, right? So B5 is the seam allowance side. Right sides of fabric together. I'm just going to do that. And when I fold down, hey, look, B5 is completely covered. And then I unfold it. Hey, I have a good seam allowance because my fold tells me my seam allowance is towards me at this point. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and take this and stitch it together. All right, so I stitched it together. You can kind of see my seam allowance is way bigger than I need it to be. No big deal. So paper side up, fold down. I'm going to trim that off. Like so. Okay. And then now I'm going to take this and I'm going to flip this fabric over. And this is going to be seam rolled or something like that. Finger pressed. All right, so now we have all of our blocks or all of our pieces sewn to our piece of paper. Our block looks really ugly at this point because it's not trimmed. Ta-da! So how do you trim a paper piece block? So remember when I said in the beginning, paper piecing is really easy to scale up and scale down, which is why it's super imperative to check your 1-inch test block to make sure that if you're making 100% this correct size for the pattern, your test block should be correct. If you wanted to make this pattern smaller or larger, or shift the size, it makes it easier if the entire block was paper piece. This one is a little harder because I have traditional piecing mixed in. But you can actually print your pieces at like 125%, 200%, etc., or 50%, and it will screw up your printed seam allowance. So the best way that I always try to trim my pieces is I'll take my ruler and I will align my 1/4 inch seam or my 1/4 inch line on the actual finished block pattern, and then I'll trim it. So in this case, I'm taking the 1/4 inch marking and putting it on the solid line. Okay. All right, take that off. And I'm effectively just doing that on all 4 sides of this. Like so. So now your B block is complete. Now do you see I have this little floppy piece? I would actually take this to the iron and actually iron it down. Depending on the pattern itself will determine when you take your papers out. When you take your papers out, you essentially need to be very careful that you're not distorting some of the seams that you've sewn. And then also, if you've noticed on the fabric, because we're kind of willy-nilly putting it together, you'll end up with some bias edges. You could theoretically start your fabrics before you paper piece as well. That may help with some of that distortion. Some folks do not like taking the papers out until you've sewn everything together. So meaning that I had a block on all 4 sides of this one here. Because this block is a mixed block with traditional piecing and paper piecing, it's up to you on when you want to take it out. I have another block here before we do the A block that I want to kind of talk about paper removal. So this is another block that I designed. This one was 100% paper pieced, and so if I had paper on all of the back sides of this, when I sewed all these pieces together, do you see kind of how all the points come together? I had learned very quickly that I should have taken the papers out before I sewed it together, because when I sewed all these points together, the issue that ended up happening was I would have paper stuck underneath my seam allowance. For this specific pattern for the sun, it doesn't matter. I think I took my papers out before I sewed the whole block together, but I left it like this, like so. So we have finished B. I'm going to do the same tutorial with the A block. A block is a little bit trickier because there's more pieces to be sewn together. So I did the same thing as I did on B, and I labeled my colors. So labeling my colors made it so I didn't have to go back to my coloring section to figure out what colors went where. And for those of you that are joining now, this video will be available after I'm done streaming, and so you can kind of listen to the beginning where I talked about templates and all the different things about paper piecing, but demo on how to do this next more complicated block. For the A piece, we'll want to figure out where number 1 starts, right? So A1 is the part that we first start with, and this is blue. All right, so before you sew anything, how do you attach blue to this A1 piece? And remember, the printed part of the template is the back of the block, meaning fabric needs to go right side up on this portion, right? So back of the block is the printed, fabric facing up is the correct direction. All right, so A1 is blue. I'm gonna take, this extra strip that I did, I'm gonna maybe cut off a couple things on it. And I am going to essentially go like this. I can essentially just say, hey, I'm gonna put this blue piece anywhere on this block. Okay, as long as I have seam allowance 100% around this A1 piece. So how do I do that? I'm going to start folding A1 to A2. because I know that's the first seam that I'm going to be sewing. And guess what? It goes into A7, doesn't matter. I'm just going to fold a little bit into that piece and call it good. I'm going to use my double-sided tape at this point. Remember, double-sided tape goes on the paper side, not the fabric side. I've done that before. You'll thank me later because getting at least this double-sided tape, because it's little small pieces off fabric, is a pain. So don't do that. All right, so I'm going to put the tape on the back of A1, which is right here. And what this is going to help me do is it's going to help me keep the fabric stable for that first piece. Okay, so all I need to do, you know what, I'm just going to, right side of the fabric goes down because I'm having the print side up. I'm going to essentially go, you know what, I think I'm going to put it here. How do I know that's going to be right? Well, I'm going to flip that piece over. I'm going to fold my seam allowance back down and say, oh, hey, you know, I have enough seam allowance on this edge because I folded it down to check. Do I have enough seam allowance on this portion? Yes, I do. So that's my A1. That's how I'm attaching A1. Theoretically, you could go, I'm going to trim this off extra. So A1 is attached to my paper. It's done by glue. It's done by a double-sided tape, but not a big deal. How do I add A2? So because I have folded where I'm going to be stitching, A2 is this next yellow 1 piece. My yellow 1 that I used earlier was this piece right here. I am going to flip this over. Now, which way do I put on the A2 piece? Remember, this is the front of the pattern. Normally when you traditionally piece, right sides together, correct? Right? So right sides together. This is the seam of A1. You want to do right sides together. I'm just going to do that like so, maybe. Right sides together. I don't even need to align my seam because that may or may not be correct. But I want right sides together, not this way. Okay? I'm going to fold where my seam allowance is, and I am effectively going to look at, do I have enough fabric on this side, right? Does this A2 have enough yellow underneath it to get the seam allowances around and cover that A2 piece? I think it does. And I actually can move it a little bit closer, right? Because this A2 piece is not very big, right? This A2 piece is kind of small. As long as it's covered and as long as I have something here, I'm good to go. Now, one thing I want you to notice, do you see how my seam allowance as it gets to the left gets almost non-existent? You may want to shift your piece a little bit to give yourself a little bit more seam allowance before you stitch. So I just rotated my piece just a little bit and comes forward. So for those of you that are just joining, I do not specify pre-cutting pieces because I personally do not pre-cut my pieces. I find that patterns that I've done pre-cut pieces for foundation paper piecing are sometimes way too big, or they're too small and then I have to recut anyways. So I find it easier just to do it this way. So I have stitched. How do I correct a mistake? Okay, give me 1 second, Karen, I'll answer your question. So, because I want to make sure that you guys understand what I just did here. So when I folded this piece, I sewed between A1 and A2. I stitched from the beginning, because this is the edge of the seam allowance of the whole block, on that line, and I went past the line. Why did I go past the line? When you think about traditional piecing and you think about your seam allowances themselves, you always you stitch from edge to edge. You don't stitch a 1/4 inch away. I mean, I guess you can if you're spinning your seams or something like that. But for paper piecing, you kind of want to do the same thing. I know other people have taught where I could essentially end exactly where this line intersects, but I find that my pieces are more secure if I stitch past it. Now, Karen, I'll get to your question. Fixing a mistake. So, for example, if this piece was, much smaller and I didn't cover all of A2, how do I fix this? Because not only did paper piecing stitch at like a 1.5 or 1.8 seam allowance or stitch length, it's stitched on paper. So how do you fix this if it's wrong? And I have a seam ripper here. So typically, if you're going to seam rip anything apart, meaning your piece was too small, you need to unstitch it. Do not unstitch on the paper side. You want to unstitch between the two fabric pieces that you sewed together. If you unstitch on the paper side, you run the risk of actually like tearing your template, which I guess isn't a horrible thing unless you're on like between A4 and A5 or something where you're almost done with the block and then you rip your template. You can, I'll actually do it on this piece. So pretend I made a mistake and I want to unstitch. If I am unstitching, I'm going to unstitch in between the fabric pieces, and I'm just going to be very careful to unstitch between them all. Theoretically, I know I'm using the seam ripper wrong. You can use it the other way. Just make sure you don't cut a hole in your fabric. I find I do that more often than not, so I'm just going to unstitch pretty quickly on this one. Okay, so I've unstitched those apart. Getting rid of the extra threads. Now this paper has already been weakened, right? Because I've stitched through it once. Karen, you're getting right to my next point. The next thing is, if you've torn this, so for example, oh no, my template tore, what do? I use like Scotch tape or something like that to tape my template back together. Easy. And then now my template is together, but because when I sew this through, I'll perforate the tape. And so when I take the papers out again, the tape will also rip apart. Okay, so now I'm gonna go back to stitching A2 together. So I'm gonna fold that here. This is my seam allowance. I'm going to go ahead and put that back together like so. Fold that. Okay. Stitch it back together. All right, so I stitched this back together. And then now to trim your seam allowances. So all of your fabric should be towards you at this point. I'm going to fold the seam towards me. And so all I have are my seam allowances facing north, or north on the camera, I guess. I'm going to take my ruler or my add a quarter ruler and trim off my 1/4 inch seam. Now what happens, do you see I have a little less of a seam here? That's okay. Remember, you're actually sewing at a smaller stitch length, so having a smaller seam allowances is not going to be a problem. All right, so now that I have this, I'm going to seam press, seam roll, iron my piece up for A2, like so. Ta-da! And I know that A2 is completely covered by that yellow. Now, this is an unwieldy piece, right? I theoretically could cut it down, but I'm going to already be doing that as I do the next piece. So you can do whatever you need to do to trim it off or something like that. I guess I can do that. Scissors. Just make sure when you're trimming this off that you're not cutting into this A2 piece. That would be unfortunate, and then you'd have to do the unstitching and restitching. Ta-da, cut that off. Theoretically speaking as well, you could add the double-sided tape on the back of every piece. I find it not necessary. I find it necessary for the first piece to help me stabilize the first piece I add to a piece of paper. And then sometimes maybe the last piece, but that's about it. The pieces in the middle, because I'm sewing on all sides of it, will naturally stay once you have them all stitched down. So I've added A1, A2. Now I'm adding A3. So adding A3, I'm going to fold on the line between A2 and A3 because that's our next seam line. Okay, so I'm going to fold that here. You can fold the whole way, you can fold just on that line, not a big deal. Where that fold crease is though, that's where your stitch line is going to go. So I have this like major fabric on this side that's just going to be cut off, that's extra, not a, you know. I probably could have folded it and then used my scissors to trim off the excess, but that's too late now. All right, so this next part, this is where it gets a little tricky. So I have a little bit left of my strip on the blue. Remember, what we want to do is be right side of fabric to right side of fabric. Right, so if this is my seam allowance, this side is all seam allowance, this is my actual fabric piece, so this is the right side of my fabric. I want to do right sides here, so my seam allowance is towards me this time. And I'm going to fold this one back, okay? Now, that fold line is where my seam is going to go. Do you see A3? That's what the color that I need to be having the blue cover. And if I'm going to, you know, look back, I'm like, oh, hey, this is the end of A3. I look back and I'm like, hey, I still see blue fabric, right? This background of that blue. I know my piece is going to be covered on A3. So I'm going to open that back up and I'm going to stitch down that line. And remember, you want to do your seam allowances on either side. So I start before that line, sew on the line, and go past that line. Like so. So started before the black line on the fold, right? So if you're wondering how I know how to sew straight, I folded that line, so I'm starting on the sew, I'm starting to sew before the solid line on the fold, and then going past that. Okay. So again, paper side up, A1, A2 towards me, because that's where all the fabric is, right? Because A3 is still folded down. I'm going to fold what I just sewn down, like so. And now I'm going to trim my 1/4 inch seam. Okay. Flip this over. I'm going to flip my fabric now because these are right sides together. I'm going to flip my fabric and I'm going to either iron, seam roll, I finger press, this is a finger presser tool, down, like so. So A1, A2, A3. Now, I'm adding A4, which is yellow 2. I actually don't even think I have enough of this. I might. I might. Yes, Sandra. Well, ask me how I know too, and sometimes, you know, bigger pieces are better. If you're a newer paper piecer, big pieces. Big pieces and batiks will also help you. All right, so do the same thing. I'm adding A4, so I'm going to fold on the line between A3 and A4. There are some folks that teach paper piecing using a light box to cut more accurate pieces. There's some folks that, you know, have you trim this as a 1/4 inch before you sew. I find it all, you know, subjective and what you want to do. So folding that down. So A4, this is now the seam allowance, right? This floppy part. So right sides together. If I want the fabric to be on A4, I want right sides together with the rest of the blocks. I'm just going to do that here. And I'm going to fold this down and say, oh, okay, A4. Oh no. Do you see this piece is probably a little too small? It's probably not going to hit the whole seam allowance. Maybe I can, you know, readjust this and fold. Maybe I use that side as my seam allowance. And hey, that works, right? That works a little better. A4 end, fabric ends over here. It goes all the way around A4. Oh yeah, Karen, correct. Directional fabrics are a little harder just because you lose the ability to rotate things, and then as you flip them, the directional prints change on you. All right, so now I know A4 is going to be completely covered, right? Because I'm putting that down, the fabric there. So now I'm going to take this, flip it over, and I'm going to sew on the line, remembering that I need to sew before and after for the seam allowances. And if you missed it, make sure your seam stitch length is less than 2. A lot of people say 1 and 1.8. I use about 1.5. All right, so started before the line and after the line. Okay, so now my fabric is going to go towards me. I'm going to fold the piece down. Pop that out a little bit. This is the seam I just sewn. All the fabric is towards me at this point, and I'm going to trim the top part to my 1/4 inch. Okay. Fantastic. Right. Flip this over. I'm going to press this block over, or this fabric over, like so. You can use a seam roller. I use a finger pressing tool. You can use your iron, either way. So the next block is going to be A5. Okay, so A5, I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. I'm going to fold between A4 and A5. And I'm going to need a blue piece that's this size, or this size, sorry. I don't have a strip anymore, so I typically will just say, okay, well, I need that here. I'm going to maybe cut myself a square or something similar. The other thing that I did in the past for the B pieces, if you were here for that portion of it, I took it and I just cut a strip of fabric that I knew would fit this wide, plus seam allowances, and then I gave myself maybe like a 1/2 inch wiggle room. You can give yourself a more wiggle room than what you want. It doesn't really matter. Depends on how much fabric you want to waste. So for the center section, this is about 2 1/8 inches plus your seam allowances on either side. So I'm just going to cut like 3 inches or so and call it a day at this point. When we talk about efficiency for paper piecing, because this block uses 4 B blocks and 4 A blocks, one of the things that you can do is start chain piecing. And by chain piecing, I don't really mean like the traditional sense. I mean more of you sew all of the A1 to A2s together, and then all of the next one together, and keep going that way. Yeah, gotta check your seam allowances. Okay, so back to where I folded this down. This is where the fabric is, right? So this is the right side up. I'm going to put this down here, and I'm going to fold this down. And so because my strip is pretty big, I can see, okay, this is the block. I have passed the seam allowances on all sides. Right sides together. When I folded this down, you see I have quite a bit of hefty seam allowance between, and I could adjust that to make it a little lower, but I'm okay with this. I'm going to turn this over, and I'm going to stitch across. All right, so I stitched that across. So Sandra, there's a couple ways that you can flip. So you could, before I trim even the seam allowances, I can flip this here and say, oh yeah, I got this. Or I could theoretically just fold it back down and double check that my piece fits on the back of this piece. I have flipped this open, and watch out, because I've done this before. I flipped this open to check it, right? I flipped the piece over. I flipped this down and went, hey, I gotta trim my seam allowance. Does anyone know what's wrong with this picture? When I trim the seam allowance, my fabric for this A5 is in position for A5. So it's the seam allowance and the actual fabric. So if you do that, be careful. because I've definitely trimmed that off and went, I trimmed off A5 in this case, and then I have to unstitch and restitch it. So all of your fabric goes to one side, goes away from the seam allowances, and flip it over. So I've made that mistake before. It is usually when I go, okay, I'm tired and I'm not paying attention anymore. All right, so I've trimmed that off. And then now I'm going to press this open. Okay. So, ta-da! This is our center. Doesn't it look beautiful? Like all of my edges are perfect. No. These are all going to get trimmed off because there's going to have an A7 and an A6 piece as well. So that's kind of where we're at. So you know how I said we will tape at the very first one? Some people will find that taping this A5 piece down will help as well because it's at an edge piece and you are adding A7 and A6. So Barb, some folks use like a freezer paper method. I could never actually get my mind wrapped around that one, so I'm not the best person to show you. All right, so if you are wanting to tape this down, tape paper. Don't tape the fabric. I actually think I do this portion of it more often than not. It's quite funny or sad when I do it. Very frustrating. Okay, so I tape that down. Ta-da. So now, once I tape that down, I can actually just trim off the excess, right? Because I know where my seam allowances are. I'm just going to go like this. Cut it off. So A6, I've done 1 through 5. A6 is a yellow piece. This is the part of the main sun. Same thing as I did before, right? So I'm going to fold my seam allowance. Ta-da! I'm going to find a yellow piece of fabric. Something like this, maybe. And remember, fabric goes right sides together. Your seam allowances go on one side, the rest of it is right sides together. When I first started, was like, oh yeah, I want fabric on A6. I'm going to put my fabric here. That's wrong, right? Because if I stitch this, where's my seam allowance? So my seam allowance is together up here. So I want my seam allowance like so. This is why you fold it down and say, okay, did my yellow cover all of this A6 area? Okay. And I fold this down and you're like, oh my God, that's like 3/4 of a seam allowance. You don't need one so large. I can shift my fabric down to make my seam allowance look a little better. Fold that again. Voila. Now I'm going to stitch, starting my fold on and off the block. All right, so I stitched that from one end to the other on that line. Turn it around, my seam allowances look really ugly. I'm trying to think if you can see that. Doesn't matter. I know this piece is huge, so I know I'm going to cover it. Remember, fabric side down. I flip it off so the paper is on top. And then as I fold this down, you're like, oh my goodness, all of these things that I stitched in the seam allowance, that's kind of a problem to fold this down. Like, this is not handy. What you do is you're just going to pop the paper off and make sure the fabric stays flat. Like so. And then you see this little tail here. I'm going to just flip it over to get the paper to fold down towards me. Okay. And then now, going to trim a 1/4 inch. Voila. That's extra. Flip this over and I'm going to press this fabric out. Like so. So with paper piecing, you can get really, really intricate shapes. You can do, I've done a light bulb before. It just had a lot of pieces to do the angle, to make that curve. You can do a lot of things that you can't do with traditional piecing. So it's interesting. It's fun. It's a nice little technique. I am much rather traditional piece though. That's where I am. But foundational paper piecing, this is what works for me. And finding what works for you is kind of the key as well. So the last piece is A7, which is blue. So I'm going to do that same thing as I've been doing. Right? Fold on the line that I'm going to sew. I'm going to take, hey, you know, I have this piece. Right sides together, seam allowance here, and I'm going to go, this piece is not quite big enough. It is big enough for this triangle up here, but if you see where the fabric ends on both sides, you see how it doesn't cover either seam allowances on the block. If it doesn't cover the seam allowances on the block, it doesn't cover that area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just maybe cut a bigger piece, you know, on this. The other thing, another tip, because this is a corner piece, I theoretically could do something like this, right? So I know this is a square. I can cut a square like that. I just use the seam allowance line there. I can cut, you know, maybe like a 5-inch square. Oops. Because I know I have 4 of them, it's a half square triangle at this point. You can do like a stitch and flip. Thought process in my head is that I can cut this in half then. And then now you have 2 A7 pieces that could work. You could theoretically use that for A6 as well. All right, so right sides together for my seam allowance, like so. Flip this over. See how my fabric now goes on either side of that seam allowance. It goes all the way around. And so now my seam allowance is here. I have more than my 1/4-inch seam allowance from my fold. And I'm going to flip this around and stitch it down. All right, so I stitched that down. Ta-da! And I know, yep, this covers the paper, so I'm good there. Remember, don't fold the paper down with your fabric already that way. All your fabric is towards you, fold the paper down. Again, remember your seam allowance is here. It's a little hard. You just want to tug it a little bit. And you'll rip the paper just enough to be able to fold on the seam that you just sewed. Okay? And then now, you can use a ruler, align a 1/4 inch on your paper to cut your seam. Like so. Okay. Now on the other side, I'm going to go ahead and press this down. All right, so your A block is almost done. Now, like I did with the B block on how do I trim this, so I gave seam allowances on the sun block. If this was a normal paper piecing block where it was completely foundation paper piece, you can scale it up and down. If you scale your block up and down, your seam allowances will print scaled as well. So my best practice is always to measure a 1/4 inch from the actual block edge to trim it down. So in this case, I'm going to use my 1/4 inch line on my block to trim it. Okay. All right, so let's pretend you have made 4 of these and 4 of these for my sunblock, right? This is just, there's 4. These are just the rays. When do you take the paper out? That was a question I think somebody had asked in the Facebook group. I took the paper out before I sewed the block together. If you are concerned about how bias stretchy some of this is, you could theoretically sew the block together with the papers in and then take the papers out altogether. If you are concerned about biases and just how stretchy some of the fabric gets, another option for you to do is start your fabrics before you do your paper piecing. It'll help with that, because if you notice kind of what we did, I just kind of took scraps and put them together, and if it fit, I sewed it. Directional fabrics, as Karen had mentioned earlier, is a little bit of a problem because of how you stitch and flip and the rotations. It gets a little bit more tricky, so I would recommend that to be a more advanced paper piecer. For completely paper piece blocks, as I showed earlier, this is a block that I designed in July that's 100% paper pieced. When you look at your angles and your corners, right, everything ends up at one corner. I learned very quickly that I needed to take my papers out before I sewed all the blocks together, because if you see all the seams kind of stitched together and they all meet, the problem with the stitches and the papers meeting together is that if I didn't take my papers out early, I would have paper kind of stuck in these tips. So there you have it. Now, how do you get the paper out? Well, I used printer paper, right? That's what most people have. If you used your normal seam allowance, you would not have perforated your paper very well, because your normal stitch allowance is what, 2.5 or something like that. A way to get rid of the paper, in case you forget. What I've done in the past, does anyone have like the wool mats or something? What I've done, I don't think I have my wool mat with me, is I put it on something soft, and I'll take like the back of my seam ripper or something like that and just press on the seam, like so. But because it's soft, it kind of helps push the paper apart because you've already stitched it. If you use like a 1.8 or smaller, like I used like a 1.5 in this case, the paper itself will just perforate pretty quickly. Unfortunately, that was a boo-boo, but it'll perforate pretty quickly, and then you can actually just take your papers out. And make sure that you have these small little triangles taken out as well. And now I want to double check through my tips and tricks. So I kind of talked a little bit about this in the beginning. Paper piecing is something that you can get intricate designs, you can get super good points. I know some folks paper piece even some traditional blocks because it's more accurate for them. Like that, ta-da. What else do you need? So my supplies, seam roller, finger presser, a double-sided tape. This is like a scrapbooking tape. And an add-a-quarter ruler or just a normal ruler. Or scissors, you can do that too. Best practices, make sure that you're checking your 1-inch block on your template. If you want to make it at the correct size, make sure you print at 100%. My patterns are on US letter paper, so for those of you that are international, make sure that it's 100%. Batiks, the next thing was about fabric. Batiks have no wrong or right side, so they're easier to do for beginners, so you don't have to worry about that. What else is there? Other keys to remember on your template. The printed side of your template is the back of your paper and the back of your block. So printed side, fabric side up. Don't forget to change your stitch length to 1.5 or 1.8. Just make it smaller. You're wanting to perforate the pieces of paper. And then make sure that you're sewing your seam allowances. So, you know what, I'm going to take the paper out of this one and I'll show you what I mean. By stitching beyond that line, what you'll end up doing, so by the way, the tape on here, you just have to pull a little bit more to get that off. And if you remember, I had taped my A1 and A2 after I boo-booed and I steam ripped. and I rip the paper, it comes right off. Scotch tape will come right off like that. And then, what else is there? Oh yeah, I was going to show you the seam allowances. I'm showing you on the A block because the B block, the seam allowances are all around the edge, so it's not as, noticeable. Okay, take my papers out. So now when you look at your block, you see my seam allowances? Think about when you traditionally piece and you have pieces that come together, all of them go towards the edge of the paper, edge of the fabric, I mean. You see the seam allowances go here. So now your block is super secure. Okay. All right, so seam ripping. So if you missed that portion of it, you can go back and take a look, but I had sewn A1 to A2 and then I seam ripped them apart as a demo. Seam rip always between the fabric. If you seam rip between the fabric and the paper, you have odds of either damaging your paper template or really ripping a big hole. And so therefore, you want to just seam rip between the fabric, and then if you rip your template, use, not this, you'll use like Scotch tape or something like that to tape your template together. So this double-sided tape is like a duck tape. I don't know. It's Duck brand, but it's scrapbooking tape essentially. So it's just a tape roll. It's double-sided. Make sure this is on your paper versus your fabric. Hold on. I don't know if you can tell. This kind of comes off in like little rectangle strips. And if you put this on your fabric, it's kind of a bear to take off. And then this tape here, I think Sherry said vellum. I actually don't know. Scotch tape works as well. This is just kind of what I ended up getting. That's in my house. What else is there? I'm trying to go through all of my tips. So then trimming blocks, always trim on the 1/4 inch away from your solid line, even if your template has seam allowances printed. I always trim a 1/4 inch on the solid line. That's just habit for me because I have scaled patterns up and down before. What else? When to remove papers, trimming. Oh, efficiency. So I did a demo today on one of each of these blocks. When I sat down and sewed the original sunblock, what I did is I cut out all of my papers. I labeled them. Oh, that was the other thing I didn't tell you guys, or I didn't recap. Label your color sections here. That's how I knew when I was sewing my block what color was next without having to reference my color by section. That's easy for me. And it also makes it easy for you if you don't want to use this exact coloring scheme. If you want to, rainbow your block or something, rainbow your sun, you can do that. What else? There was one other thing that I wanted to mention. Oh, yeah, so efficiency tips. I would sew everything from A1 to A2 first. I would do that 4 times. Then I would add the next block, do that 4 times. And so I would make them in a set. So it's a little slower if you want to make them individually, but it's not wrong. I just like to be a little faster when I sew. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was about, I lost it. I thought I had it. Oh, cutting your fabric. So if you saw the beginning when I did B, if you have a big piece of fabric like this, or, fabric that's, with a fabric or something, you'll want to cut maybe a strip to help you out. And so how do you determine what strip size to cut? I look at the template pieces and I say, okay, what's the biggest size piece that I'm going to have to cut for this template? And then plus the seam allowances, don't forget those, and then I add a little bit more. Like I add like a 1/2 inch. So for example, on this B to A1 piece, I would have cut, this piece is 2 inches, with the seam allowance is 2.5. I would have cut like a 3-inch strip for me to be able to piece these pieces together. This works also for some of the bigger paper piecing patterns. If you have templates or things that are a specific size, You can cut strips of fabric that way as well. If you guys missed it, I do not dictate how big you want to cut your pieces because I tend to think that designers are really trying to make sure you don't waste fabric while paper piecing. And so they give you a square or a rectangle that is perfect for paper piecing. Now, I tend to mess up a lot because stuff shifts. If you saw my demo, a lot of times I'm like, oh yeah, my seam allowance, it kind of shifted on me a little bit, but it didn't really matter because I had enough fabric to maneuver and cover the pieces. I make sure I use a generous amount, but I don't use like 3 inches too big, if that makes sense. If any of you guys have any other questions, make sure to comment on the video and I will try to get your answers to you on that one. But I hope you enjoyed this. I did both A and B blocks, so you can go back and watch the video and whatnot. So I hope this helps. I hope to see a lot more suns in the Qual by the Sea for the Partners in Design group. And then if it's not shared in that group, I'll make sure to get this video shared there as well. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their Saturday. I'm going to clean up a little bit and then, nope, that way. My links are that way. I'm going to be streaming on Twitch. I'm going to be doing something. I think I'm actually going to be doing some fabric weaving. So if you guys want to come hang out and chat, I'll be there. So I'll talk to you guys later.